What's up, folks? Welcome to the Stupid Fans Club. I am your host, Shaan Donn, and welcome to the club. We are here to break down the college football playoff top 25 rankings for this final week of the regular season. A lot of updates, a lot of changes, a lot to talk about here. So let's jump right into it. Starting at the bottom, we have Colorado coming in at 25 after their tough loss to Kansas. Their rough loss, actually. It wasn't even close. They lost to Kansas, so they are at the final spot in the top 20. BYU and Iowa State, Arizona State are at 16, 18, and 19 to round out the teams from the Big 12. Kansas, again, has just left that conference in shambles. I mean, they have run through the top three big dogs in the Big 12. And Arizona State has caught fire at the right times. Man, that's been interesting. They all pretty much have an uphill battle to make the conference championship to then try to sneak into the college football playoff. And we'll see what they can do. But right now, Arizona State is in the best position at that 16th spot. The thing that stood out to me at first was Alabama's ranking. They are a 3-loss team, and their most recent loss was to Oklahoma, and that was a road game for them. They got blown out. It was not close at all. I believe they were at the 7th spot last week, and now they are at 13, just outside of the top 12, aka they're not out of it. And that's shocking at first glance. And I hear and see a lot of commentary on this. People think this is favoritism. How are they a 3-loss team? How do you look like that on the road and come back and are just outside of the top 12 here with a chance to still make the playoff? And I think what we're seeing with a 12-team playoff at the moment is we are going more to a NFL layout, an NFL structure. So with the 4-team, obviously it was, I mean, if you lost a game, you might as well pack up your bag and go home because you're not making the playoff. Like a 1-loss season was like, everything is up in the air now. 2 losses was like, oh yeah, sayonara. So with the expanded playoff, this gives teams more of an opportunity to still make it and not let a couple losses or 1 loss or so ruin your chances to make the playoff. Now, you do expect a 3rd loss to pretty much seal the deal, especially against an unranked team, middle of the road team like Oklahoma. So in the fashion that they lost, it was what big loss. It wasn't close at all. But I think what the committee is now doing is, again, they are trying to no matter your record, but they're taking the record into consideration, but also looking at the eye test of who is the better team. Where it starts to get tricky here is like, okay, how in the heck is Alabama at 13? And then you look at Ole Miss, who is now a 3-loss team. They're at 14. You look at South Carolina. The one thing I probably would change was moving South Carolina up. I would move them ahead of Ole Miss and Alabama. Although Alabama did beat South Carolina, if you watch that game, that was very close, and that was more so of South Carolina just couldn't capitalize when they needed to, but they had every opportunity to beat Alabama. And then I just think they're better than Ole Miss, especially right now. I think they beat both of those teams today if they played. They have a really good defense, good wins, and they got a big game coming up against Clemson this weekend. So I would move them up. But then after that, if you look at the teams behind Alabama, you got to start asking, like, who is actually better than Alabama? Are we saying Tulane is better than Alabama? Are we saying Iowa State is better than Alabama? Is UNLV like where? And so why I think they're going to more of an NFL structure is because like you get that third loss. Yes, it looks bad, but are we just punishing you in the rankings like it used to be before this expanded playoff? Or are we still taking everything into account and saying, okay, yes, they have 3 losses, but they are still better than X, Y, and Z teams who are just behind them. So I think that's what's happening, and I think that's fair. I mean, let's take the Falcons and the Denver Broncos, for example. They just played, and the Broncos are not at the top of their division. The Falcons are at the top of their division. And they had, at the time when they matched up, the Falcons had a better record than the Broncos. The Broncos beat the brakes off of the Falcons in that game, and they looked like a clearly better team. And Falcons defense seemed to get exposed. There was just no resistance at all. Bo Nix looked like an MVP candidate out there. And so that is what you risk here. Again, let's go back to the last year when Georgia played Florida State. 2 teams that felt like they were robbed out of an opportunity of being in the top 4. And, you heard a lot of whining and crying from Florida State, and a lot of players did opt out. But the end result was Georgia put up 60 on Florida State. TCU made the playoff over Alabama and other teams because of their record, and Georgia put up 65 on TCU. So the committee, I think, is very mindful of things like that, and they don't want to just react. They don't want to just punish you like, oh, you lost 3 losses. You're number 24 in the top 25 now. Like, I think they're still taking into consideration, which again is a more NFL approach. If we were just going off records and the specific divisions to seed teams in the NFL, then it was like the Broncos would have never even had an opportunity to prove that they're better than the Falcons, right? Like, so I like the approach, and I do understand the gripes and understanding. It shocked me. It jumped off the page of like, I was expecting to see Alabama almost in the 20s after that. But, it's when you look at the teams behind them, it's kind of just, I don't know. The one team I could maybe give a the one team I can maybe say, like, obviously I said South Carolina, I think they should be ranked higher than Alabama. And the other team I'll probably look at is Texas A&M. Texas A&M is a good football team. They have a very real shot at beating Texas next week, especially with them playing at home. College Station, that's going to be a tough game for Texas. So, but again, you start wondering who you're putting over Alabama. And then you got to ask yourself, am I just trying to punish Alabama for losing their 3rd game? Or do I truly believe these teams are better than Alabama? And most of those teams, absolutely not. So I think that's what that is about. But we'll see how things shape up here. This makes things interesting. We got next big one was Indiana. They are still in it after their loss to Ohio State. They are at the 10 spot, and that's not shocking. That's right around where I expected them to be, and didn't miss the playoffs. And I think they also benefited from your Alabama and Ole Miss losses last week. That allowed them some room to still be there. But I definitely think it was borderline. I think they may at best have gotten the very final spot, but there was a chance that they fell out. Even though, again, it's an NFL format, an undefeated team. Everybody was kind of looking at the Chiefs this year. It's like, man, y'all have been escaping in a lot of games. Y'all haven't looked great in your wins, but y'all are the number 1 team. And now we're seeing like, okay, this is a very beatable team, and now they've lost and all these things. So I think this is your record isn't everything. It's about who you play, your division, and all of that. And I think they are pretty appropriately ranked here. Those were really the main surprises. Go Dogs. Georgia moves up to the 7th spot. Miami still at 6. Notre Dame still at 5. And we still got the same top 4. But those were the major callouts from the rankings. And now if we go over to the bracket, this is where we can start having some fun. So again, we have the top 4 with Oregon, top team in the Big Ten, Texas, top team in the SEC, Miami, the top team in the ACC, although they are not the top team in the ACC. They are the highest ranked team in the ACC, but SMU is actually the top team in the ACC. But they are the highest ranked, so they have the 3rd spot. And then Boise State, top team in the Group of 5 league there. So let's see. I think we got. So let's go through the matchups based off of where the rankings are now. We would have at the 5 and 12 game Ohio State versus Arizona State. Again, these would be road games for the lower seed. So Arizona State goes to Ohio State. In the 6-11 game, we got Indiana going to Penn State. In the 7-10, we have SMU going to Notre Dame. In the 8-9 game, we got a rematch at Georgia versus Tennessee. When you look at the rankings, the best spots to have right now, based on what we have, would be 5 and 12 and 6 and 11. The 2 lower seeds, the 3 and 4 seeds, because if you win that first week, if you win that matchup, you then go and play a Miami team who has a very questionable defense and a team that they do have an explosive offense. So your defense will need to be ready to play. But you like your chances against a Miami here. And you win that game, you are right there in the semifinal. You just need to win one more game to make it to the national championship, and that's anybody's game there. So you have a very visible path to winning a national championship if you're in one of those seeds. So then the 5-12 is the same thing. You got Boise State, the weakest team in the top 4, and a team that you may not know much about, but you know about Ashton Genties. You're ready to say, like, hey, you're a one-trick pony doing this against Wyomings and Idahos and all of this, but you're not gonna do that against us. You got a team like Oregon who's already played them, and it was a close game, but Oregon prevailed in that game. So you like your chances as a Power 4 school going up against a Boise State. And again, if you're in that 5-12 seeding, you win that game, go on to play Boise State, and you beat Boise State, you're in the semifinal, one game to win before the national championship. So you have easier paths. The absolute worst spot to be in is the 8 or 9, which is where Georgia is at this particular moment. Being that we are in the SEC championship, things could change here pretty quickly. But Georgia at Tennessee, the winner of that game goes and plays the number 1 seed Oregon. That is pretty daunting. And then the 7 and 10 seed Notre Dame versus SMU would then go and play Texas, which would be tough as well. But the absolute worst is clearly the 8 or 9 seed. You don't want to have to go and play the 1 seed the very next week in that matchup. But let's just go through some predictions and scenarios here since we have it up. Ohio State, Arizona State at Ohio State. You like Ohio State. Ohio State has shown that they've had a lot of big matchups this year, and they've answered the bell in every single one. Even the Oregon game where they lost, it was only 1 point, and they had an opportunity to win that game. So you like Ohio State, who then goes and plays Boise State in that matchup there. 6 and 11 seed have Penn State at Indiana. I think that's an even more exciting matchup than the Ohio State at Indiana game, because now that we've seen what happens against Ohio State and Indiana, Ohio State is clearly a gear above Indiana. Ohio State was also a gear above Penn State. And so you got these two teams. It's like we're still trying to figure out, like, how good are you? Like, how good are you really? And I think that would be a great matchup for them. And again, 6 and 11 seed. If that stays true, you then go and play a Miami team who a lot of people have as overrated, and you like your chances in that game. Those are good matchups. That game, it's very tough to say. I really can't call who wins a Penn State versus Indiana matchup. I feel like they have the two same brands like this year. Two teams that are good, but how good are they really? Because neither one of them. I mean, Penn State had the closer game against Ohio State, but you never were really felt like Ohio State was in jeopardy of losing that game. So I think that's an intriguing matchup there. I guess I would just have to lean to Penn State, being that they've played in these bigger matchups and they've been good more often than Indiana, and that's a tough road game for them. So I would lean towards Penn State in that game, but very tough to call. And 7-10 matchup, Notre Dame at SMU. Notre Dame has been very consistent since their upset loss against the NIU earlier in the season. And I described them as that team that seemed to have they got a big win at the beginning of the season against Texas A&M too. But I described them as that team that just shows up with their lunchbox, goes to work, goes home. Haven't heard a lot of talk about them. Haven't heard a lot of theatrics or drama going on over there. It is just they show up every week, win, and they go home. So Notre Dame versus SMU. I like Notre Dame in that game. SMU is at the top of the ACC, but the ACC isn't all that scary of a conference. Notre Dame doesn't even have a conference. So, I think this would be an interesting matchup. Teams that don't get a lot of coverage, but I do like what I've seen from Notre Dame. I think they move on in that matchup. And then we got Georgia and Tennessee. Tennessee would have to go back to Georgia. I've mentioned this before. I hate rematch games in the same season. I hate it. That team comes out with a different edge, different energy to them, and weird things happen in those type of games. But I do think the better team is Georgia. Georgia should win that game, but that would be a very intense game. I think you would see some adjustments from Tennessee. I think even Tennessee, things got away from them, and Georgia's defense started to clamp down, which we see when they do that, they are tough to beat. You saw a similar result with Texas when they played Texas, but Tennessee got off to a 10-0 start. So Tennessee, I think, are kind of just looking like, if we can find a way to sustain that, like we were up on these guys, and then we just lost it. So I do think Georgia is the better team. I think it would be close, probably closer than the last game, but I got to give the nod to Georgia. I think Carson Beck has been playing better. Their defense, it's getting healthier, potentially getting some players back on the offensive side. In a home game for Georgia again, I like Georgia to move forward there. And if that is the case, then we would make the next round an Oregon versus Georgia, a Texas versus Notre Dame, a Miami versus Penn State, and a Boise State versus Ohio State matchup. In that matchup, in that lineup, man, I mean, if we start from the bottom, Boise State versus Ohio State, I think Ohio State handles Boise State. I think Miami versus Penn State, man, I like Penn State because I think their defense is pretty solid, and I don't think Miami's defense is. And I think Miami has an early exit, and Penn State proceeds. And then a Texas Notre Dame matchup be a lot more competitive than people may realize. Haven't been super impressed with Texas as of lately. I think that would be a good matchup. If I have to just guess right now, I'll give the nod to Texas in a close matchup there. And Oregon and Georgia. I love my dogs, but that would be a very tough matchup for Georgia. I think it does depend on what Georgia we get. Does your defense show up? Does your secondary handle those receivers well? How do y'all stop the run? Can y'all create turnovers? If you get the Georgia that showed up against Tennessee and Texas, Oregon may be going home. But if you get interception, Carson Beck, an offense that just looks stagnant, as we've seen many times this year, and defense giving up the run and big plays in the secondary, Georgia's going home. So tough to call. Guess I'll give the edge to Oregon, but very, very tough to call. So it sets up some good matchups there. I mean, I would love to see how these things play out. I think on the left side of the bracket, we have Oregon and Ohio State rematch, and then it would be a Texas and Penn State matchup there for the semifinals, and that would be incredible. And then if that is the matchup, I give Ohio State the edge in an Oregon rematch, and I give Texas the edge over Penn State. I think Texas is better, and that would set up a Texas and Ohio State championship game. Give me Alabama. No. Texas versus Ohio State. That is a really good matchup. Ohio State has the better team. Give me Ohio State to win the national championship in this bracket. I hope I'm wrong. I hope Georgia finds a way. But based off what we're seeing right now, based on these matchups and what these teams are showing, that would be my predictions there. But very exciting to see. We got one more week of the regular season. Can't wait to break these down and see the changes. A lot on the line for these teams going into the last week. And we got conference championships, and then we get to the nitty gritty, the playoffs. So excited to see how things play out here. But we will be back this weekend or after this weekend and seeing how these matchups play out. And we'll be back here to break it down. Until then, take care. Happy Thanksgiving. We'll see you soon.